And on the chemical weapons allegations, do you see a parallel here to Syria, a sort of recycling of the Syria playbook where the U.S. accused Syria and their Russian ally of committing chemical attacks, Syria with Russia's support? That was the allegation. When meanwhile, as we know from the reporting of Seymour Hersh and also from OPCW leaks, that all the intelligence pointed to these chemical attacks either being carried out or staged by sectarian death squad rebels fighting the Syrian government.
Well, there's a lot of evidence for that. There's also, I'm told, some evidence for the involvement of MI6, which is a very effective organization and very adept at this sort of business in Syria. They may once again be involved. Who knows? I mean, we all have intelligence services. All intelligence services are involved in these conflicts in one way or another. So I think if you go to Ted Postel's work, who's very good on this, as well as to British sources, and you will confirm what you just outlined. You're asking me what I know, and unfortunately, I don't know too much. What I know is what is open source, and I'm prepared to believe any number of different possibilities. But I've said repeatedly, until someone gets in there who is not Ukrainian or Russian and looks at the evidence, we're probably not going to know with certainty what's really there. I found that in the Balkans, when we were dealing with the Serbs and so many things they were accused of turned out to be false, that the Finns were enormously helpful. The Finns would go in and they were the truth tellers. We really need some truth tellers like that. But for the moment, that's not going to happen. So the worst thing that could happen is a false flag. We have to be prepared for that. And again, that's where the president of the United States plays such a critical role. Unfortunately, Mr. Trump was deceived on both occasions because his inner circle kept pushing him and pushing him to launch those missiles. And ultimately, we did. They went into the dirt. They accomplished nothing. By the way, the Russians accommodated it. It's unfortunate, but that's the way it went. But finally, in 2019, when Mr. Trump was ambushed by people in his own administration and the military in an attempt to bring on a war with Iran, after the shoot down of the global hawk that was deliberately flying a path that everyone knew would be engaged, he said no and ended that possibility. Thank goodness. So I think it depends on the president and whomever is close to him to make the decision. No, we're not going to act if that in fact occurs.
Yeah, I think uh, there's a, a higher chance now of some kind of staged event or false flag than at any point because all of the other military options have been expended. I was actually in a debate on CGTN with one of the main kind of Ukrainian influencers who's a hardline parliamentarian, Ina Sovson. And when I heard her say that we are expecting a chemical attack, that's when I knew. And then I started to see this narrative get rolled out by all of the Biden proxies and the Newland proxies about biological weapons, false flag by Russia. It became clear they were preparing for something, along with all the censorship and the attacks on Tucker Carlson for actually, because he would be the one person with a national audience to push back on another Duma style incident. So it really does feel like all the signals are blinking red as Mitt Romney's former advisor, Kofor Black, who went on to work for Burisma, said days before 9/11. Now, on if you want to add anything to that, feel free. But I wanted to ask you about another issue. There was a cruise missile attack on the Yaroviv base, which is just east of Poland, inside Ukrainian territory, and it's known as this kind of international peacekeeping center. It was home to mercenaries and Redditors who were coming because they were bored with their lives as computer programmers to participate in a war they thought was going very well for Ukraine. Let me just throw up on screen some of the testimony from one of the people who was a witness to that attack, who was a U.S. Medic who wanted to be a combat medic. And, you know, this is from one of the Reddit chats. You weren't expecting missiles at a war? No, just not at that base at that particular time. Shit surprised us, including the Ukrainians. And then he gets called an idiot. And then he refers to the volunteers who have come in from around the country as cannon fodder, you know, basically being bodies shoveled in front of the Russians. He called the Ukrainian commanders crazy, and so on. And then they all turned tail and ran home. At least 35 foreigners are dead. It could be as many as 200, but that seems to be the end of the Ukrainian Foreign Legion. But my question is not only about that, but about this wider issue of that base being there and having hosted many NATO training sessions. Could there have even been NATO trainers who were hit in that attack? And can you address this concept of the NATOization of Ukraine? I mean, most Americans think Ukraine has not been formally admitted into NATO. However, we hear from the Russian side that it effectively has been NATOized. What do you know about this base, and what about this wider concept of NATOization?
Well, the NATOization has occurred, and this is one of the reasons why when people say the probability that Ukraine would be admitted to NATO was always low for all the usual reasons, the lack of human rights standards, the lack of true democratic elections, the overwhelming corruption, and so forth. The problem with that is that the Russians have watched carefully at how rapidly we are willing to waive things in order to get new members into the alliance. And I think they concluded that regardless of what the true circumstances were, this NATOization had reached the point where if Russia did not firmly object and demonstrate its opposition, that Ukraine would be admitted. So I think the NATOization argument is very true. And that's one of the reasons we got large numbers of people out of there as quickly as possible when it became clear that the Russians were going to intervene. We didn't want hundreds of our advisors and so forth captured by the Russians. So yes, the place is NATOized. That's true. But NATOization is really U.S. led. And we tend to drag other NATO's members with us. The British are there because they tend to be fellow travelers with us. And like us, they don't live on the continent. So if things really go badly, just like the United States, the British will simply go home to the island. This is why large numbers of Europeans dislike them intensely and don't trust them. So yeah, that's very much the case. There's something else though at work here, and that is that Putin wanted to demonstrate, and I'm sure he gave permission for this strike, because I don't think any operations west of the Dnieper happened without his authorization, because I know that in the original thinking, there was no desire to press west beyond the Dnieper River. I mean, that's the heart of Ukraine. The people that live there really are Ukrainian in language, culture, and so forth. Doesn't want to go there. And I think what he did is he said, yes, we'll do this because we need to show these people that we can reach out and touch them anywhere in Ukraine. This happened to be very close to the Polish border, so it had a double message. It was a message to the Poles that if you continue to provide support to the Ukrainians, and if you try to widen and escalate this war, you too will become a co-belligerent. And the Ukraine and the West, the Poles don't want that. They know that.
Well, on this topic of NATOization, let me ask you about the dimensions of this that go beyond Ukraine itself. Asking you to talk about, for the last 20 years, the U.S. has been continuously dismantling arms control treaties. The anti-ballistic missile treaty was dismantled in 2003. The Conventional Armed Forces in Europe treaty expired in 2007. Putin, in his Munich speech, vocally protested that. And countries like Romania and Poland have built these U.S. missile sites. The U.S. says that they're intended to protect Europe from Iranian missiles.
Yeah.
I wonder if you can comment on that and the role that this dismantling of arms control treaties, also the INF treaty, which expired under your administration, under the Trump administration, how that's contributed to Russia's feelings of feeling encircled, and how what those developments played into Putin's decision to invade Ukraine.
I think all of those issues contributed to the buildup in the minds of Russians of the need to protect themselves. There's no question about that. I think the decision on the INF treaty was a serious mistake. The Russians, frankly, were shocked by it, but there was a huge lobby, all neocons on the inside of the administration as well as outside, who were trying to convince everyone that arms control was a waste of time. Arms control protected us in no way. Arms control should be abandoned. Now, I'm the first to admit that arms control is difficult, because if you see a violation by one side or the other, you're very reluctant to admit it, because if you tell the other side that you're aware of their violation, then you risk revealing that you have the collection capability, that you have sources, maybe even human sources on the ground reporting to you. So you have to judge the violation very carefully and decide whether or not it is egregious enough to justify bringing it to the table. Now, I was not part of the INF talks at the time, but I was told by several people, you have to know, you have to understand, they're not doing what they said they would do, and we have to pull out of this. And I looked at the evidence that I could see, and all of it seemed to point in the direction of Russian paranoia about our behavior. And you mentioned the missile sites down in Romania, for instance, and I had suggested on one occasion, why don't we invite Russian officers to come over and view it? If we're absolutely convinced that this is all for the purpose of defending ourselves against a potential Iranian ballistic missile attack, then we should bring them in and let them look at it and satisfy themselves that this is no threat to Russia. Well, you can imagine the response that I elicited. I was told that I'd lost my mind and this was never going to happen, which leads me to believe that these things had very little to do with Iran and a great deal more to do with Russia. Again, you're always weighing, as a great power, the wisdom of doing something or not doing something on the assumption that what you do is going to have an effect on your potential opponent. I don't think we've done a good job of that. And I think we have too readily dismissed the potential adversary as too weak economically and too backward in many ways to respond. That's not true. That has never been true. The difference in the size of the economy is real, but that does not reflect on the Russian military or on the quality of its scientific and technological capabilities. So I think we've put ourselves in this position. And we did so very, in my judgment, very cavalierly, because we actually did have a long period of time where we had established a degree of mutual trust and cooperation. And all you have to do is look at the space programs, look at the extent to which we purchased Russian rocket engines, look at the cooperation we've had with them on the JCPOA and other things. This has not been a black and white situation, but we are now transforming it into one, which I think is stupid, self-defeating, and unproductive. And of course, we're not thinking at all about the blowback on ourselves economically and in other ways. And we talk about proliferation of dangerous technology. Well, the Russians have been very good about not necessarily providing much of what many of their alleged friends or temporary partners have wanted. What will they do in the future, given the way we have treated them? I don't know, but I don't see much good happening. It does worry me a great deal.
What did you make of the Biden administration's responses to Russia's proposals when they called for neutrality for Ukraine and for a rolling back of offensive weapon systems inside Eastern Europe? My reading of it is there was some flexibility. For example, you mentioned inspections of U.S. Missile sites in Poland and Romania. I could have it wrong, but I believe the Biden administration signaled some potential openness to that. I'm wondering what you think of how Biden responded and also Putin's decision to invade. Do you think that he had other options? And strategically, from a Russian point of view, was this strategically the right move? Or do you think there was possibly more room for diplomacy, not only on NATO and missiles, but also on the status of the Donbass and the war there?
Well, I think the one voice of reason in the Biden administration is the CIA director or the National Intelligence Director, and that is William Burns. He has always been a voice of reason on the subject of Russia, and he has tried to, what's the right word, modulate the Russian hate that is so prevalent. But again, he's being crushed by those who see Russia as something that has to be denationalized, much as the left is denationalizing the United States as a place whose borders have to be open to allow mass migration from the developing world into Russia. All of these things are part and parcel of the reasons people hate Russia. And of course, Russia declares itself to be an Orthodox Christian country. That's completely unacceptable because atheism, nihilism, multiculturalism, all of these things are caught up together. And there's a vile hatred for anybody who thinks the kinds of things that exist in Russia could be remotely positive in any way. William Burns has tried to push back against that. He's tried to reason with people about it. It hasn't worked very well. But I think there was a chance for a short time. Now, Putin, from where he sits, looks at what's going on. He's aware of the things that we're discussing, but he also saw a large troop buildup in eastern Ukraine, approximately 60,000 troops that were poised to strike at the Donbass, at Luhansk and Donetsk. And I think he was persuaded that this would happen and that obviously the Donetsk and Luhansk republics and their population would be destroyed. And he could not sit by and tolerate that. I also think he thought that there was no hope, that every time he tried to make the case, which he did several times, no one would listen to him. Somebody said, well, the reason this didn't happen under Donald Trump was that Donald Trump is strong and no one would challenge him. Well, it had a lot less to do with that than Trump's private willingness to listen to Mr. Putin's position. What disappointed Putin, and I think many others, was Donald Trump's inability to get control of his own administration. He appointed people that were absolutely opposed to him and his thinking. So from the moment he opened his mouth and said, why can't we have a better relationship with Russia, he was sabotaged and subverted. Putin realized that. Then I think he waited to see how Biden would respond. And of course, you know that Biden was bragging about how he told Putin that he was a vicious killer and a thug, how proud he was of insulting the man to his face and denigrating him and what he's done inside Russia. I think you put that together with the buildup in the East, and I think he felt Russia was genuinely threatened, and he thought it was only a matter of time until something akin to the Pershing II missiles that we once had on the ground in Germany would show up in eastern Ukraine. And we can all sit here and say, oh, well, that wouldn't have happened. But he had a lot of reason to believe that it would, for the reasons we've already discussed, the NATOization of things. And that's the kind that, remember, the Pershing II was a hypersonic missile. You know, you're talking a few minutes and it lands in Moscow. And he kept telling people this. No one would listen. And there was no willingness to reassure him and his government in any way, shape, or form that this was not the intention. So I think he rightly concluded he didn't have much choice. And I think the biggest mistake that he's made, if he's made any with this operation, so I think he's tried to be too careful. And I think it's tragic. But when you do what he's done with his force, you try very hard to avoid unnecessary civilian casualties and avoid damage, you end up in the position he's in. This thing has lasted 3 weeks, longer than he would have liked. It creates opportunities for your enemies, for your opponents to meddle in what's happening. It gives false hope to people on the other side. That's the problem. And that's what he's up against. And I'm sure he's heard that from his inner circle. I'm sure some of his senior officers have said that. And if you try to convince anybody in the United States, by the way, that Vladimir Putin was remotely concerned about the loss of civilian life in Ukraine, well, they'll laugh you off the stage. That's impossible. He's evil. He's terrible. He's bad. It's a lot of nonsense. He was, and he still is, I think. I think he would like to get an agreement because I don't think he wants anything to do with going into Kiev.
Yeah.
That's the last option. I mean, if you look at it right now, Kharkiv and Kiev are about it. The cauldron has to be dealt with, and they're still laying siege to Mariupol. But I'm afraid, given the enemy that they have cornered there, the 3,000 Azov members, they're probably going to reduce it and be done with it. But that's clearly not what he wants in Kharkiv. That's clearly not what he wants in Kiev. But if he can't get somebody to put their name on the agreement and agree to those basic terms, then I suppose he's going to act.
Well, let
But
me
Russia
ask you,
has attacked Kharkiv. I mean, there were civilian buildings hit there.
yeah, the question is whether they will actually go in and in the way they treat it, the way they did Grozny, for example. And
Yes, I think you're right, Max, and that's the point, Aaron. If you go back to World War II, one of the first things that all sides learned in the war was that you don't win a city by going room to room and building to building to flush out your enemy. Doesn't work. You bring up artillery, you lower the guns and direct fire, and you bring down city blocks. That's what happened in Warsaw. It happened in Stalingrad. It happened all over Europe, all during the war. When we went into Manila, we did exactly the same thing. It was ferocious. Nobody wants to do that. It is the worst possible outcome. And that's why, for instance, as I was telling you earlier, I looked at some film footage this morning that came from Poland that was transmitted into Poland from Ukraine, showing Ukrainian citizens that had showed up at an exit point from Mariupol where the Russians said, come out. We have humanitarian assistance, in other words, food and medicines and so forth. and you will be protected. And sure enough, there was the Azov battalion. You're not leaving. You're not going anywhere. And the people, of course, were distraught. But that's where we are.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of these sort of incidents at checkpoints of motorists being shot, particularly men. There may have been even some Western journalists or a journalist who was shot at one of these checkpoints. Still looking into that, but that narrative obviously isn't getting out. I know you have to go soon, Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Just wanted to ask you, based on your last comments about negotiations. That is obviously part of the Russian strategy. It's the linchpin of the Russian strategy to advance, to inflict damage on the Ukrainian military while negotiating in order to affect what's been taking place at the table. Because there have really been no negotiations for the last year that have had any effect at all. So now we're starting to see some movement. I think Vladimir Zelensky has said publicly that Ukraine does not wish to join NATO. I guess my question is, do you think, I mean, you have sources all around the region. Do you think Zelensky even has the ability to negotiate, given the different forces in Ukrainian politics, the hardline forces, the US? And how do you see the negotiations shaping up when the US is so, at least at this point, when the Biden administration is so hostile and determined to escalate?
Well, let's be frank. Zelensky right now has better press than Mother Teresa. So he's reluctant to give that up. And he's become a rock star to the West, pretending to be a lot of things that he's not, but it's worked very well for him. He has always been in danger of some of the hardliners, the radicals that control, frankly, the SBU, the equivalent of the secret police inside Ukraine, as well as the military, of being assassinated himself if he went too far. I don't know if that's still the case. I'm sure there's some truth to that, but I really think that the cards are in the hands of Washington and in the hands of President Biden. And President Biden is in a position that's not very different, since Aaron Mate is interested in Vietnam, not very different from Lyndon Johnson in this sense. Lyndon Johnson wanted to end the war in Vietnam. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that he didn't want to go there at all. But it didn't make any difference, because he was afraid that if he didn't do those things, that he would be outed as soft on communism and a friend of the Reds and so forth. And so Johnson found it impossible to simply cut his losses and get out, which was the right thing to do in 1968, 69. All the generals privately said, this is a waste of time. We're not going to win it. Let's go. He didn't do it. And obviously he didn't run for re-election. I think Biden's in a similar position right now. He's got the uniparty out there depicting him as feckless, weak, incompetent, incapable. If he were to simply say, all right, Mr. Z, the show's over, sign on the dotted line, we'll back you, we'll help you rebuild, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think he can't do that. I think he should, but I don't think he can. And I think every time he's inclined in that direction, he's warned by the people around him of the dangers associated with that. Now, there's two
political
things.
dangers.
Yeah, but there are a couple of things that are also happening. The assumption is, well, if we can just keep the Russians in the field long enough, their army will collapse. Well, there's no evidence for that. If we can just keep them in the field long enough, the population at home will say, bring them back, and this is bad. There's no evidence for that right now. But there's a lot of evidence that our position economically is going to continue to weaken. You had Mohammed El Arian just the other day, who said 100 basis point increase in the interest rates, in other words, a 1% rise, could send the American economy into a recession, a deep recession, maybe something worse. Well, the longer this goes on, the harsher the outcome for us here at home. You know that gasoline prices, like so many things, are lagging indicators. So the real problems have not even struck yet. So if you look at the prices of food, energy, metals, these kinds of commodities, then add to that the enormous sovereign national debt that we have to service, and the unambiguous requirement to increase interest rates and deal with inflation that is ostensibly dangerous to the economy. The question is, how long before we fall apart? How long before we simply can't go on? I mean, I'm always reminded of the question that used to come up in graduate school and then subsequently when I was teaching. When did the British leave India? Well, the British did not leave India when they should have, when it made sense to do so, when it was strategically advisable. They left India when their debt to GDP ratio was 240% after World War II in 1947. That's when they left because they were broke. I suspect that we'll have something similar to that here in the United States. That will be a game changer. But all the expectations of imminent failure in Russia, I think, are ridiculous. I don't see any of that. And I think they'll stay the course. It's vital. It's a vital strategic interest for them. It isn't for us. It never has been. That's the problem.
Well, Colonel Douglas Macgregor, we're coming up on an hour. You're invited to stay with us. We have a
I'm glad you
massive
reminded
audience.
me. I'm surprised my phone has not jumped off the table here.
I
But
can
thanks
hear
very
it.
much for inviting
can
me. I
hear it.
appreciate it. I wish you guys well.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much. And,
Colonel. Thank
you
you.
know, judging from the feedback we're getting, our audience salutes you and thanks you for your honesty in a time of just complete deceit. So thank you so
Yeah,
much for
I'm
joining
afraid
us.
so. Well, Americans are beginning to figure things out. It's slow, painful, but they're beginning to figure things out. And when you start to hear people refer to anyone they disagree with as a traitor, you're in a lot of trouble. That doesn't
Yep.
speak of strength. That suggests real weakness in the
Yep.
government and the people that run
Yep.
it.
And as I've
And
been
I wish
saying, I
the
think,
president would step forward and put a stop to it, but he won't.
yep. Yep. No, it is a complete, a sign of a lack of confidence in the system that they claim to represent, the democracy they claim to represent. And I've been
One
saying,
last thing. During the Kosovo air campaign, I had a British major who was in the intelligence section of the Joint Operations Center where I was the director. He got into something of an argument with people that worked for Alastair Campbell. These were professional spinmeisters that had been sent across by Tony Blair to help, quote unquote, spin the air campaign as a big success. And this British major got into an argument with him. And finally, the British major he said, look, you can't say that. That's not true. He said, well, of course we can. Doesn't matter whether it's true or false. And he said, look, if our cause is just, why do we have to lie about it? And I think that's where we are right now in Washington.